Geez, 25 bills. Okay. Good morning. It is Wednesday, April 7th, 8:35 a.m. This meeting is Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are turning back this morning to pick up H108, an act relating to Vermont standards for issuing a Clean Water Act Section 401 certification. So we had a little bit of discussion on it last week, but we didn't do a full bill walkthrough yet. So I wanted to ask Mr. O'Grady to do that so that we'll really know the details of the bill and the whys and wherefores of on it. So good morning, Mr. O'Grady.
Good morning. So just some background before I put the bill up on the screen. The Clean Water Act requires states to develop water quality standards to maintain traditional uses of those waters. And then when there is going to be an applicant for any federal license or permit to conduct an activity that may result in a discharge to a state water, the state agency needs to issue a certification that proposed activity will meet the water quality standards. So before you can get a federal permit that may result in a discharge, you need to get a state 401 water quality certification. Now, Vermont issues its 401 certifications. It's been authorized to do so. But the 401 certification requirements in the Vermont water quality standards do not specifically apply to wetlands. Now, the state statutes require a discharge permit to a wetland, and ANR has been applying the 401 certification analysis to wetlands, but the water quality standards do not specifically reference wetlands. And that's important because there has been litigation in other jurisdictions regarding federal or interstate projects that require a 401 certification, where the litigants have argued that the 401 certification shouldn't apply to a wetland or shouldn't apply to a certain type of activity because it's not specifically referenced in the state's 401 certification statute or rule. So to avoid that issue in Vermont, H108 would formalize ANR's practice of applying the 401 process to wetlands in two ways. First, it would amend statute to specifically reference the standards that ANR will require compliance with under a 401 certification. And then second, it corrects the omission of wetlands from the water quality standards by requiring ANR to include wetlands under the water quality standards through rulemaking. Water quality standards are a rule. ANR is actually engaged in amending those rules, or basically preparing to amend those rules. And so this would now become part of that process. In addition, H108 also requires an alternatives analysis of these activities that are subject to a 401 certification. And by that, I mean that they will look to see whether there is any reasonable, practicable alternative that would have less adverse effect than the original proposed activity. So that's generally what H108 does. And now if you want me to, I can put the bill on the screen and walk through it step by step.
Okay, great. To make sure I caught what a discharge permit, is that always federal, even if Vermont's issuing it?
Vermont has been delegated the authority to issue NIPTES permits.
Yep.
Vermont's discharge program is more expansive than the NIPTES permits. So it's a little bit of, it's yes, the Vermont discharge permits satisfy the federal requirements, but they go further than the federal requirements.
So it's like our slaughter stuff, equal to or better than.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, so this is H108 as passed by the House. It is currently on Senate Natural Resources Committee page. The first section is amending 10 BSA 1253H. This is actually the section in the water quality chapter related to classification of waters. It's being placed in this section because it's also the section where water quality standards are required to be adopted by the Agency of Natural Resources. So what it does is subsection H requires ANR to administer a Clean Water Act Section 401 certification program to review those activities that require a federal license or permit to ensure that those activities comply with the water quality standards, and to incorporate in additional provisions that the state has adopted as part of its water quality law. And the first you'll see is wetlands. So when they do the 401 certification, they will review whether or not the proposed activity complies with the state wetlands law. They will also review whether it complies with the stream flow regulation law, the stream alteration requirements. Also look at lakeshore protection standards, stormwater management, because our state stormwater law is more expansive than the federal. Management of lakes and ponds, that's encroachment onto surface waters. And then the ANR rules for water withdrawals for snowmaking. So basically looking at the full suite of water quality laws that Vermont has and seeing whether or not this proposed activity complies with those laws. And then it goes on to...
Can I answer? So I'm just trying to follow here. Why do we, so we already have B through F, correct, in the water quality standards?
No.
We do, I mean, those are existing water quality
Those are
standards.
existing programs. They are not
Right.
existing parts of the Vermont water quality standards. That's exactly why this is being done, because if ANR was going to look at a proposed activity and say, hey, that proposed activity isn't compliant with our lakeshore protection standards, and then the applicant says, well, your lakeshore protection standards aren't in your Vermont water quality standards rule. They're not something that should be applied to this certification. So that is exactly what this is intended to address. A through F is really the plus the water quality standards are the full suite of water quality law in Vermont, but A through F are not listed specifically in the water quality standards.
Okay, so A is new. B through F are existing practices, but not yet in the standards. So is this basically like an improvement by making the list more inclusive of every program?
A is not a new program. A through F are all existing programs.
Okay.
See, so let's leave the lead in. The secretary shall administer the program to ensure that a proposed activity complies with the water quality standards, as well as with any other appropriate requirement of state law, including A through F, right?
Got it. Yep.
So when they do the review, they review water quality standards, and now they review these specific programs and compliance with these specific programs. The agency is largely doing this already, but this basically codifies that. So if there is a challenge to their authority to assert one of these requirements in a 401, the agency can say, this is what our General Assembly requires us to do.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Then you'll see ANR shall deny an application for a cert unless the applicant demonstrates all of the following. There is no practicable alternative to the proposed activity that would have a less adverse impact on waters and wetlands of the state, and provided that any proposed alternative shall not have other significant adverse human health, safety, or environmental consequences. So that's the alternative analysis that has to be done when the applicant applies for the cert. They will also have to, ANR will also have to determine that the proposed activity will not result in the violation of any applicable water quality criteria established in the water quality standards, and that the proposed activity will not result in a violation of the state's anti-degradation policy. Okay, does anyone have any questions?
Yes, please. Let me pause and see. Okay, on A, which just went off the top of the screen there, the less adverse impacts. So is this a standard test we use elsewhere? It's making me think of Act 250 with no undue adverse impacts.
There are alternatives analysis elsewhere in law. This is not the same, but it's similar to how other states do the 401. Alternatives analysis are required in other states for the 401 certification.
Okay. On C, we my request this fall on behalf of this committee drafted a letter to Secretary of ANR about the anti-degradation rules. So I'm just trying to think of if we don't have the anti-degradation rule, I'm just wondering if we have a sort of a clear legal connection. Like, okay, we have a policy of degrading water, not to degrade waters, but if we don't have a rule, is it something that's implementable yet?
So the anti-degradation policy it's a policy that's required under the Federal Clean Water Act that says no pollutant discharge or activity will be permitted if it will cause the surface water that already meets water quality standards to drop below those standards. That policy has been incorporated in rule. It is in the Vermont water quality standards. There is a anti-degradation policy in rule that is enforceable. What is not in rule is how ANR will actually implement that policy. The General Assembly has required ANR to adopt that implementation rule for, it's probably going on a decade now. But ANR has not done it. What ANR has done is they have adopted an internal agency procedure for how they would implement the anti-degradation policy. So there is an anti-degradation policy. It is in rule. It is binding. And the agency has a procedure that informs how they implement it. Whether or not everything in that procedure would be binding, if litigated, is a question probably for courts. I don't know if it has been litigated. I don't think it has. And that's why the General Assembly is looking for a rule in part. So anti-degradation is still enforceable in Vermont.
Okay. So is this one of those distinction without a difference until it gets tested in court?
I think there's a distinction between implementation rule and procedure. Procedure generally is supposed to govern internal agency operations unless the General Assembly authorizes the agency to adopt a procedure of greater scope. The General Assembly didn't do that in this instance. So there's an argument about the applicability of how wide of a scope that ANR procedure has in its applicability. And there's probably at least one person on this call that can talk to you about that as well.
Okay. Great, thank you.
So
yes, please.
Should I move on?
Yes, thank you.
So now you're into sub 3. This is 3A is kind of the standard for what is practicable under that alternatives analysis. If it is available and capable of being completed after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics in light of overall purposes of the proposed activity. So that is the standard for how ANR will determine whether something is practicable. And then failure to comply with that alternatives analysis shall not be the basis for denial of an application for a 401 cert if the proposed activity is exempt from those requirements under a rule adopted by the secretary. So basically, this allows A&R to adopt by rule exemptions to the alternatives analysis. And those exemptions will not be a basis for denial of the cert. Should I move on?
Are there exemptions? I know we're talking about changing how this is all codified, but are there exemptions currently under the water quality standards?
So the degree of specificity for how, well, generally, yes, there are some exemptions, but then you're giving A&R rulemaking authority to adopt more in this bill.
Thank you.
Okay. So secretary may issue a certification required by the subsection to any general permit or authorization issued by a federal agency. So, for example, the Corps of Engineers has general permits for dredge and fill under the Clean Water Act. That is a federal permit. So somebody that's applying for that federal permit may need to should get a 401 certification. The state has issued a general 401 certification for that general permit. So you don't need to go through the individual process of getting the Clean Water Act 401 certification. It's already been granted for that core general permit. And this is just basically formalizing that the Secretary A&R has that ability. And it says an applicant's compliance with that federal permit or authorization shall be presumed to be in compliance with the certification unless the Secretary determines that an individual review of the applicant's activity is necessary to assure compliance with the water quality standards and other applicable state law.
Okay. And is that relationship to the Army Corps?
It's the core. Usual. Is that relationship usual? Yes. I'm not. This is an ongoing practice.
Yeah.
And this basically formalizes that. This is not unusual nationally to have a state issue a 401 cert for a general permit. Or
okay.
So should I move on?
Yes, please.
Section 2. This is the directive to A&R to amend the water quality standards to include an amendment to the classification of state waters to clarify that with regard to class 1 and 2 wetlands, the uses to be protected under the water quality standards include the functions and values of wetlands as described in section 5 of the Vermont Wetlands Rules. So basically, the 401 certification, the water quality standards are now going to recognize protection of the wetlands of significant function and value under the water quality standards, which A&R has already been doing. This formalizes it. And they will also include an amendment to the Anti-Degradation Policy to clarify that wetlands and their functions and values shall be protected as described in the Wetlands Rules. So Anti-Deg will now apply to wetlands. And any additional provisions the Secretary determines as necessary to implement the requirements, the 1253H, which is that statute that we just walked through, including any exemptions to the alternatives analysis for projects that are not likely to have significant impacts on water quality or wetland functions or values. And there's a specific exemption for state or municipal road or highway projects that require certification under section 401. They shall be exempt when a separate alternatives analysis is otherwise required under state or federal law. So some of these road building projects, they're subject to federal highway law or NEPA, where there is already an alternatives analysis required. This is to avoid them having to do duplicative alternative analysis.
Okay.
And then you get, Senator Bray, something you love, the rulemaking timing.
Thanks so much.
A&R shall file with the Secretary of State the proposed rules within 90 days from the effective date of this act. On or before January 15, 2022, they report to you, the General Assembly, regarding the status of the rulemaking. The report shall include a draft of the rules, and then on or before March 1, 2022, A&R shall file that final proposal of rules with the Secretary of State. And that final proposal is also submitted to LCAR underneath 841. So you will get they will initiate by 90 days from the effective date. They'll give you a draft by January 15, 2022, and then they will give you their final proposal by March 1, 2022.
Okay.
The rulemaking and the rulemaking timing go into effect on passage. The certification program, the statutory change, takes effect on the date the rules are adopted under Section 2. So that's so that the statute and the rules are aligned and there isn't conflict between statute and rule.
All right. So once rules are adopted or approved, then the cert program comes under. Got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to
All right.
stop sharing screen. There you go.
Any questions for Mr. O'Grady on this? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the walk through. I'm just thinking, one question that I have is, what's the relationship between this proposal and we're talking about class 1 and 2 funds. There's the world of agriculture, wetlands can be part of arable land. So how does this change in law impact anything related to agriculture? Or maybe it does not because it's exempted elsewhere.
That question came up in the House, and I think it largely does not apply or won't be that significantly applicable to, let me step back, I'm using too many qualifiers. I don't think this will result in significant change for how farming is conducted in the state, even with farming conducted in converted wetlands. Farming in converted wetlands is largely exempt underneath the U.S. Corps' dredge and fill rules. So you don't need a federal permit to conduct it. And so it's authorized. And if it isn't already exempt, there's a general permit, and that general permit, A&R could issue a 401 cert for that general permit. I don't really see a significant change for almost all farming in converted wetlands. Now, if the farm is going to engage in some other practice that requires a federal license, maybe they're going to put in, I don't know, some sort of electric generation that's going to connect to the grid and may require some sort of FERC authorization. And they're going to have to do dredge and fill to do that. Well, there's already some provisions in dredge and fill law about electric generation, but they might have to go through this analysis, and they might have to go through the analysis. And then in going through the analysis, they will have to look at the impact on all of those state laws, state resources, and they will have to do a alternatives analysis. So I really think for the great majority of farming activities in wetlands and farming activity in general, it won't change. There's possibility that it may apply to some activities on the farm.
Okay. How about wetlands? I mean, so it sounds as though it doesn't have any impact on But can you review for the committee what happens if you have wetlands that are not currently on a farm, that are not currently in production, and then you decide, you're going to start using that as pasture or a hayfield, or put it into corn? Is that quote unquote conversion, and does that trigger any kind of review? Or
if you are in a wetland and it is not, if you have a wetland on your property and it is not currently exempt from farming, currently engaged in farming, if you then convert that, can I get back to you on that? It's kind of a nuanced
Sure.
response because there's state law and federal law that, and I want to
Sure.
review that. I'd want to get that right. And so I want to review that standard before I respond.
Okay, sure. All right. Yeah, this is reminding me a little, we had that wetlands working group.
Yeah.
And it got very tricky to sort out, which I think is why we didn't get to a final conclusion in the end. All right. So if there are no other questions for Mr. O'Grady, thank you very much. And Mr. Coleman, as I understand it, Jeff Nelson had to step out. So you are pinch hitting.
I am. Good morning. Jeff and I were both scheduled to testify, so I'll try and cover the ground that both of us were going to speak to. I listened to the testimony, I guess it was maybe a week or so ago, from John Groveman and Jim Dumont and Commissioner Walk. So I'll reference some of that. I agree with most of what was said. Just for the record, Warren Coleman with MMR. Primarily the clients I was working with here were Velco and the Ski Area Association. Also, obviously, with an eye towards some of the utilities with Pomerleau Real Estate. So I worked with Jeff Nelson, who, as you know, is a consultant with VHB and has experience across a very wide range of different projects, from renewable energy projects to ski areas and all sorts of different types of commercial development. Also worked with A&R General Counsel Matt Chapman, John Groveman from VNRC, and Jim Dumont working with VNRC, and Tim Folensby, who's sort of the senior permitting person at Velco, has the most on-the-ground experience on this. And we spent about a couple weeks trying to craft the bill in such a way that it accomplished the purpose that the advocates were seeking, which Ledge Counsel O'Grady went through very clearly, by trying to make it explicit that when there's a 401 water quality certification, that wetlands, that there's not a perceived legal gap there, that wetlands are explicitly covered when the state needs to issue a 401 water quality certification that's triggered by a federal license or a federal permit. And so I think it accomplishes that. That was the primary goal. The other stated goal was that this was designed to get at large projects. I think Mr. Dumont represented the other day, the concern was interstate pipelines and the perceived lack of jurisdiction if you had a federal license or permit, and the state's limited ability to have control over permitting, and the 401 being the sole hook, so to speak, or tool that the state had. So with sort of the large projects in mind, what we did here, and the language is really captured, it's on the bottom of page 2, top of page 3. This is the language that Mr. O'Grady read through before about the general permit. And so just for a little bit more context, it's very typical that their Army Corps issues a general permit to cover a wide variety of activities that are deemed to be sort of minor in scope, generally, 5,000 square feet or less, sometimes a little bit larger, but a class of a whole range of different activities that they feel are minor in scope. And then the state agency issues a 401 water quality certification that gets paired up with and covers those activities under the Army Corps general permit. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that that process stayed intact, and that that this bill did not inadvertently take all of those minor projects and put them into a new process. And given again the scope that this was designed really to look at and make sure that these larger, more complex projects were the ones that the state was able to have the tools to look at more closely, and in particular protect wetlands. I think all the parties agreed that that this addition and this clarification made sense. So that was the primary thing that we worked on, is to make sure that all of these smaller scale projects, culverts, utility, when utilities are doing work and need to build a road in order to service the transmission power line and so forth, that these smaller scale projects would still be eligible to be covered by the Army Corps General Permit, and also the accompanying water quality certification from ANR. So that's what that accomplishes. It does say in the very last sentence, and this is sort of repeats what's in the state 401, that if there is an activity that the state sees as part of getting coverage under that Army Corps General Permit, and they say, this seems like we need to take a little bit harder look at this, they still have the ability to require an individual water quality certification. And I think they've done that in rare instances, but it's not often, but they retain that authority. It's in the 401, and we've retained it here in the language in the bill, just to be 100% clear that state has that authority.
Okay. So 5,000 square feet actually a threshold that's in the law that you were, when you say minor?
Yeah, the General Army Corps permit has two sort of subcategories. One is something they refer to as self-verification, meaning you don't have to give any notice to the Army Corps if it's generally below 5,000 square feet of impact, then they don't require notice. And then they have sort of another tier. Sometimes it's sort of between 5,000 square feet and an acre, then does require pre-construction notification to the Army Corps. And that is also something that the state gets notification. So that would be the situation where the state could say, yeah, this looks like we might want to issue an individual water quality certification for this project. So that the permit is tiered in that way. And that's through most of the different activities that are outlined in the general permit.
So 5,000 square feet sounds pretty small. There's houses bigger than that. But on the other hand, think about a road. If you were talking about utility access or something, if it were a 10-foot wide road, that would be 500 feet long. So if they have to build an access road to do maintenance work, are these things usually left in place, or it's like that could be a lot of fill actually, to get in 500 feet.
It could be both, and in a lot of cases, really what the core permit is getting at permanent impacts.
Okay. And if there were, who would assess whether or not you were filling wetland as you had to bring in gravel in order to gain access? I mean, is there a standard applied? Someone will say, well, you need to provide a culvert here to make sure that there's still flow through this area, even though you're building, in essence, sort of a dike out of gravel. How does that work?
Sure. I mean, I'm assuming you'll probably have the Agency of Natural Resources back in to check in with them on this bill. So I'd certainly defer that question to them. But as in most instances, there's consultation that's done with the wetlands section at the DEC on most projects.
Okay. All right.
The only other thing I would add is that we did the effective date, which you took a look at, that second part of the effective date. We wanted to make sure that the rules were in place before the new program was stood up, so you don't have projects that are in sort of in limbo. So that's reflected there in B in section 4.
Great, thank you. Any questions from Colvin? All right. Well, I won't count our chickens till they hatch, but you've used the wetlands word and things are still pretty calm. So that's a good sign so far. If there are no further questions for Mr. Coleman, I think then we're all set. As I mentioned, Mr. Nelson couldn't join us. Something came up, but Mr. Coleman's covered his testimony. So I think other than going back to hear from the agency, I just want to check in with the committee and see if anyone has questions. If there are other witnesses you'd like to hear from, rather than checking back in with the agency. And we had one question from Mr. O'Grady, but that was it. Senator McCormick.
Thanks. I don't know if it's that I want to hear from someone else. Perhaps we can answer it right now. Just could we briefly revisit exactly how the law defines wetlands? And what I'm getting at is the standard complaint from constituents is that, you know, I can't do anything because a puddle in my yard has been defined as a wetland. That kind of, you know, man can't farm anymore because of this wetland. What exactly brings people into jurisdiction? I don't know if I'm asking Mike or maybe Mike.
Sure. So it's not it's a I guess I'm going to use a term that's probably not exactly appropriate. It's kind of a holistic review. So the specific definition means those areas of the state that are inundated by surface or groundwater with a frequency sufficient to support significant vegetation or aquatic life that depend on saturated or seasonally saturated soil conditions for growth and reproduction. That's the definition of a wetland. But wetlands are only regulated in the state if they are a Class 1 wetland or a Class 2 wetland. A Class 1 wetland means it's a wetland identified on as significant based upon evaluation by the Secretary that it serves the functions and values of 905B18A, and the Secretary has determined it's exceptional or irreplaceable in its contribution to Vermont's natural heritage and therefore merits the highest level of protection. That's a Class 1. So it's about, first, does it meet the general definition of it's inundated by surface or groundwater with a frequency to support significant vegetation? Then A&R needs to look at it, and reviewing all the functions and values that wetlands provide determines whether or not it's exceptional and irreplaceable. That's Class 1. There are not that many Class 1 wetlands in the state. The vast majority of regulated wetlands are Class 2, means it's either identified on the wetlands inventory map already, or the Secretary determines it merits protection based on an evaluation of the functions and values. So it's up to A&R to review the wetland and its functions and values and to determine that it merits protection. And then
there is a lot of okay. So one of the complaints, does a lot of this actually depend on somewhat unpredictable judgments of administrators?
It depends on
a lot of the, we're not your answer did not include gallonage or area. It has to do with qualities,
functions and
how
values.
How a determination, how a determination is made on those criteria.
So the functions and values,
just
right. So the list of functions and values begins with the lead-in language that the identification of wetlands that are so significant that they merit protection. Any determination that a particular wetland is significant will result from an evaluation of at least the following functions and values which a wetland serves: whether it provides temporary water storage for floods, contributes to the quality of surface and groundwater through chemical action, naturally controls the effects of erosion and runoff. There are about 7 other factors that I could walk you through that A&R will review, and they have a whole wetlands program. They have wetlands analysts that go out. They have guidance for how they do it, guidance for how they make their determination. But it is not, as you said, a black and white metric that they can go out and look at and say, oh, this is more than 500 square feet of wetland, it's regulated, or it's less than 2,500 square feet of disturbance in a wetland. It's not, that is not part of Vermont's wetlands law. The agency attempted to change wetlands law, the wetland statute, a couple of years ago, and they wanted it to be more consistent with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which has more of a they have a kind of a metric driven system. But that quickly runs into what is exempt and what is not exempt, how it affects farming, how broad of an exemption do you want for farming, because the federal exemption is broader than the state exemption. And it quickly gets bogged down in some really difficult technical questions. There was a study committee that the General Assembly set up to actually look at how to amend the state wetlands law. And as Senator Bray, I believe, referred to earlier, didn't reach much of a end product.
So am I correct if I say there is administrative discretion, also known as wiggle room, but that this is not a completely arbitrary or subjective judgment? There are criteria that you either can point to or cannot. I mean, they're there or they're not.
Right. Prior to like 2010, you just needed basically hydrophytic vegetation in an inundated area, and that would qualify you potentially as a class 2 wetland. The criteria are a little bit more narrative, but the analysis is significantly more, I would say, detailed. This is one of those programs where the agency spends some time creating an administrative record to support their determination. Now, people don't always agree with that, and that's their right.
Right.
I just remember there was a situation, somebody built a house on a wetland, and people are like, well, it's not a wetland. Well, how do you know it's not a wetland? It's been dredged and filled at that point, and it's like, it depends on timing, depends on time of year. And that's what the analysis is supposed to take into account.
Senator McCormick, I don't want to interrupt if you have
Okay.
more.
No, I'm satisfied with the answer. Thank you.
Okay. And Mr. O'Grady, so everything that's has some of those wetland characteristics that's not class 1 or 2, just by default becomes class 3.
Correct.
Sort of the system. Okay.
It's still a wetland, but it does not rise to the significance that requires regulation by the state.
Okay. And well, so this is probably an A&R question. So I'll just ask it briefly. If you say ask A&R this one. If we're talking about supporting whatever flora and fauna that's wet some of the time. What happens? Some wetlands are like a vernal pool or something like that. So wetland, I don't know if a vernal pool is a wetland, but there are places that come and go. They're wet and then they may well dry out for part of the year. Do they stay a wetland even if they've naturally dried out half of the year?
Yes, just because it's dried out doesn't mean it's not it dried out at some part of the year doesn't mean that it's not a wetland. And then there are underneath the A&R rules, there are certain presumptions that a wetland will be determined to be significant. One of them is that it's a vernal pool that provides amphibian breeding habitat. Another is that the wetland's a headwater wetland, or another is the wetland is adjacent to impaired water and the impairment is related to the wetland water quality function. So there are certain wetlands that are just going to be presumed to be significant enough to warrant regulation.
All right, thanks Senator McCormick for the question. And if there's nothing else, then I think we're, for the time being, other than hearing from the agency to sort of close the loop on this.
Have we already heard from, and I don't know if it makes sense, but did Chair Sheldon come in and did I miss it? Do we have any specific questions for that committee?
We did not have that committee in. I'd asked to get, we actually were going to have the reporter in, but our schedule changed on the fly. So we had to and we didn't have, it was Representative Doe, I think, who reported. So we could hear from the report.
I was just there. I'm fine without hearing from them. I didn't know if anyone had specific questions for them or not.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we're all set on 108 for today. And if anyone has someone else they want to hear from, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to schedule A&R to come back in and sort of close the loop and tie up any loose ends. And here comes Senator McDonald. Okay. Thank you, Mr. O'Grady. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. And with that, we're actually a little ahead. We're going to have a conversation following up on the Bennington water reclassification issue. And we're taking that up at 10 o'clock. All our witnesses are in. So good morning, Senator McDonald. Unless anyone has something they want to discuss right now, we're ready to take a break until 10 when that next topic starts. We don't usually have extra time, but today we do. Just a housekeeping note. So after that, we'll be going back to our weatherization bill. We talked tuning up the language and bringing stuff down the hall to appropriations. I had asked our counsel to draft some language. Stephanie Barrett is coming in from Joint Fiscal. I don't know if they've had a chance to address the concern of how we might put into that energy savings fund and then not be excluded from discussions about its appropriation or adjustments to it, because some of that money could be spent over a period of 2 or more years. So I didn't want to be in the sort of locked out of the quote unquote bank account. So that's part of what and then there were some smaller adjustments to language. My hope is that as a committee, we'll gather any changes we want, and then I'll be able to bring them down along with Senator Westman to appropriations as a batch so that we're efficient about asking for appropriations time on it. And that's pretty much it. till 10 o'clock, we'll be picking the Bennington water situation again. All right. So